All right, today I want to start talking about colonial America. So we're going to be starting with British colonization, and we're going to kind of continue on up until the kind of mid 1700s. First, let's kind of review the colonization that took place before the British got here, and then we'll kind of compare it to what the British were doing. So remember, the Spanish were all about those three G's: gold, God, and glory. And so, really, what they were about was conquering and converting the natives to Catholicism. The French, on the other hand, are the ones that started the fur trade with the Native Americans. And so remember, they had to have kind of a better relationship with them. While the Spanish were conquering, the French were more befriending. I don't want to give you the illusion that the French were wonderful to the natives, or that they didn't have any sort of prejudices or anything like that, but they did have a generally friendlier relationship with them. The British are going to colonize a lot later. They're also going to colonize very differently. The Spanish are coming over and they are bringing people over in pretty big numbers, and the French to a lesser extent. Remember, they don't need quite as large of a population, but they're going to have some pretty big colonies as well. But the intention is going to be kind of different for the British, and as a result, you're going to see a lot more people colonizing from the British, and it's going to be done in a different way. The British are really going to start bringing settlers over specifically for new land and for access to resources, because Britain is a tiny little island nation. And so for them, people who didn't already own land didn't have very many land ownership opportunities. Britain can't just expand. They can colonize, they can go different places and send their people to different places. But whereas places like France and Spain, their borders can kind of shift and change, Britain is an island. And so after taking over Ireland and Scotland, that's really all there is without going somewhere else. And so what you're going to see is a lot of poorer people, or people who are just in search of land ownership opportunities coming to Britain. They're also really going to focus pretty heavily on gaining resources and gaining a place to sell things. So just like we did with the Age of Exploration, with the Spanish, we looked at Europe and we kind of saw what was going on and why they wanted to explore. I want to look at Britain and see why they didn't start colonizing, because Spain, Portugal, France, all sorts of places are going to start colonizing in the Americas before Britain gets there. And one of the big reasons for it has to do with the Tudor dynasty, this line of kings. We're going to start with Henry VIII. So you've got Henry VIII, and then his son Edward is going to take over. And so this dynasty is going to be fraught with a lot of instability, especially political instability. It all starts with our boy Henry. A lot of people know about Henry VIII because he had a bunch of wives. And that's really important to this story. You would think a bunch of wives, religion, why is that gonna mess things up? So what ends up happening with Henry? He marries his first wife, and she has a daughter named Mary. All right. But after she has Mary, she can't seem to get pregnant and stay pregnant. And our good friend Henry really wants a male heir to carry on his line so that his male heir can be king after he dies. It's very, very important to him. And so he wants to divorce his wife and marry somebody else who can produce a male heir. At the time, though, England is Catholic, and Catholicism kind of frowns on divorce. And so Henry has to get permission for this divorce from the Pope himself. So he asks the Pope, he's like, hey, can we just break this off? Because this lady, she can't seem to have a kid for me. Like, it's not going well. And the Pope is like, nah, we're Catholic. We don't do that. That's not a good reason for you to get a divorce. And so Henry's like, okay, cool. Can't get a divorce. What about an annulment? So I don't know if you guys really know what an annulment is. Um, I I learned what an annulment was because of Britney Spears, because she got married and she got an annulment in like Vegas or something way long ago. But so an annulment is basically you get married and you pretend that it didn't happen. And you can do this for a few different reasons. Like if somebody lies going into a marriage and there's kind of like false ideas behind the marriage, you can get an annulment for that. Or if you can't consummate the marriage for whatever reason, that's a reason. There's a bunch of different reasons, but none of the reasons that Henry was giving were good enough for the Pope. He was like, look, we can tell that your marriage was a real marriage. You have a whole entire baby. And so, no, we can't just pretend that it didn't happen. So Henry is going to proceed to throw one of the most epic hissy fits in world history. And his hissy fit is going to form the Church of England. Now, the Church of England is basically the Diet Coke of Catholicism, right? It's basically England is still sort of Catholic, but instead of the Pope, you've got Henry in charge of everything. So he's the guy that makes the decisions. Now, this doesn't seem like a big deal, right? This doesn't seem like it's going to have a profound impact on anybody. It's basically the same thing. It's just a new guy in charge. But religiously speaking, this is huge because according to Catholic doctrine and belief, the Pope is chosen by God. And so to just say, yeah, we're just going to kind of nix the Pope and I'm going to be in charge, it's huge. And people are required to renounce their Catholicism and follow this new state religion. So that's going to cause a lot of tension, a lot of upheaval. And what you're going to see from this point on is a lot of back and forth as far as religion. So Henry is actually going to have a total of 6 wives. Most of them are named Catherine. I think it's like 3 out of 6 of them. He divorces 2 of them. 1 of them dies. 2 of them he beheads for affairs. And his last wife is actually going to outlive him. Now, he has a total of 3 children. I already told you guys about Mary. So you've got Mary. He's also going to have Elizabeth. And his final child is his male heir named Edward. So Edward is the son that belongs to Jane Seymour, the wife who died. Edward, just like his mother, is very sickly. So he becomes king after Henry's death. He is a little bit more stringent as far as enforcing the Church of England, making sure that people aren't practicing Catholicism. But he is going to die fairly soon after taking the throne. So Edward is king, but he dies, and so Mary is going to become queen. Now, here's the thing. Edward, remember, was Church of England, right? But Mary was actually a Catholic. Now, remember, her mom was the one that Henry divorced first. And so she's going to go into, basically, she's going to be outcast. She's going to go into exile with her mom. And so she's raised Catholic. She comes in, and I don't know if you guys have ever heard the phrase Bloody Mary, right? The lady, like you say it 3 times in the mirror. We're not going to mess with it because I don't know if I believe in it, but like we're not gonna, it's kind of like Ouija boards. Like you don't have to believe in it to be like, I'm not gonna try because I don't want to see if it's real. But anyway, so Bloody Mary, right? She's nicknamed Bloody Mary because when she comes to the throne, she is going to convert England back to Catholicism, and she is going to kill people who don't agree with her. A lot of them. And now remember, you had all this upheaval during Henry's reign because people were being forced to renounce their Catholicism. Well, now people are being forced to renounce Church of England, and they've become very attached to this religion. So it's kind of wishy-washy. We're going back and forth, right? And she's killing people who don't agree with her. she is going to die, and her sister Elizabeth comes to the throne. Now, Elizabeth is a Protestant. So you can see we've got a lot of back and forth happening here, you guys. There's a lot going on. So Elizabeth is a Protestant. She is going to bring some stability to the empire. There's going to be a lot less enforcement of the official religion. There is still going to be a state religion, but it's going to be a little bit more stable, there's a little less back and forth. And it's around the time of Elizabeth that the British are going to start sending out people to colonize. That's actually why the first colony is Virginia, and it's named after Elizabeth, who is called the Virgin Queen. Now, she probably wasn't actually a virgin, but she never got married, which is fair because she saw her dad and his 6 wives. So I probably wouldn't trust the institution of marriage either. But so she never gets married. She's called the Virgin Queen. That's how we end up with Virginia. All right, so I want to go through a few different settlements with you guys. And so we're not going to talk about each of the 13 colonies and what they grew and what they did and all that. I think that's boring. We're going to talk about the colonial regions a little bit, because that's going to be important later on in kind of coalescing the difference between the North and the South, which is going to have a huge impact on the way the United States, like the trajectory, and it's going to end up with us in the Civil War. But I do want to talk about a couple of important settlements, and the first one is Roanoke. And Roanoke is super, super interesting, you guys, because Roanoke is the time that we lost a whole entire colony, not just once, but twice, which is hilarious. The first time we don't lose it so much as we kind of abandon it. The second time we don't know what happened. So this colony is set up on an island. It's the first settlement that the British are going to make. It's chartered by this guy named Sir Walter Raleigh in 1585 as a launching pad for exploration. So 1585, remember 1492 is when our good friend Christopher Columbus comes over. So this is about 100 years or so. I mean, not quite, but about 100 years. So it's been a minute. The idea behind Roanoke is, since it's an island, it can be almost like a rest stop where you come in, you kind of buy some food, have a little break, and then you go on to the mainland exploring and doing what you're doing. So it's supposed to kind of make them money. Now, the first settlement ends up being abandoned because of a lack of supplies. The reason for that is they kind of underestimate how long it's going to take them and what they're going to need to set everything up. So they set everything up, they realize, holy crap, this isn't going well. So they send some people to Britain to go resupply. The people who are left, though, realize, hey, these guys are not going to get back before we starve. It's going to be bad. They also have a lot of tension going on with the natives in the area. There's actually this whole big story about this one guy who started a fight with some local natives because he thought that they stole his chalice. I'm convinced that this chalice was the chalice of Helga Hufflepuff. It's a Horcrux. That's the only reason to start like a whole entire war with people for stealing a cup. But so he starts this conflict. They realize they're going to run out of supplies. And remember, this is supposed to be a launching pad for exploration and kind of like a rest stop. And so a ship is actually going to come. It's going to dock. They're going to be kind of chilling, resting for a little bit before they go back to England, and the settlers are just going to kind of hitch a ride because they realize they are not going to survive until reinforcements and supplies come. So we abandon our settlement. Then we're going to have a second settlement. This one is led by a guy named John White. John White is actually going to be the grandfather of the first British baby that's born in the colonies. Her name is Virginia Dare. Now, They have kind of the same problem as the original Roanoke, which is they don't have enough supplies to last them um, until they're going to actually be able to like harvest stuff. And so John White and an expedition are going to go back to Britain. They have planned a little bit better. They should be back before everybody runs out of stuff. Things are looking good. Unfortunately, the British go to war with Spain. And that war with Spain is going to cause that supply run to take longer than was expected. By the time the crew gets back, everybody is just gone. They have all disappeared. Like it was the rapture, you guys. They're all gone. Now remember, this is an island and there are no bodies. There's no sign of like a struggle or anything. The only thing that is left is the word Croatoan is carved onto a fence post with CRO carved into a tree. And so Croatoan, this word, this is a native group, all right? So this is a Native American group of people who live on a nearby island. Well, what logically probably happened is the settlers ran out of supplies or there was war or something. Something happened and they were like, okay, let's go to this island and ask the Croatoans for help. We'll leave a little note, but we don't have, paper or anything, so we'll just carve it into the fence post. They'll come back, they'll know what happened. Well, because of some unforeseen circumstances, John White never actually makes it to the island to check and see if that's where everybody went. And so as a result, today we have no idea what actually happened to them. Because yes, logic dictates that probably they went to the Croatoans for help, but it could also have been a message crying out for help. It could have been like these are the guys who kidnapped us. So there are lots of different theories about what could have happened. Some that are as crazy as aliens. There's one theory that I've heard. The Croatoan natives supposedly had the power to turn people into things. Like they could turn people into like trees or shrubs. And so some people think that the Croatoans like magically transfigured all of the people into something else. My favorite though is the theory that there was basically a miniature zombie apocalypse. This is what I would like to believe happened. And so there's actually some science behind it. So remember we talked about the Columbian Exchange and how people are being subjected to new diseases. Well, sometimes when a disease is introduced, it mutates, right? And so the idea is the Europeans, the British people who were settling here, a disease started running rampant and it mutated and caused people to start craving flesh. And so they started just eating one another. And that's what happened. Everybody died and became literal zombies. And so it wasn't a huge zombie apocalypse because they were on an island. And as we all know, zombies can't swim. So they were on this island. So they couldn't get anywhere. And eventually they didn't have any more food. So they just kind of died out. Or eventually the Croatoans came and they took everybody out, which would explain why there's no bodies or any like zombies running around. The Croatoans in this scenario would have carved the word Croatoan. Because they wouldn't have been able to leave a longer message. They didn't speak English. So they carved it as a message so that the British would come and ask them what happened, and they could be like, your people turned into zombies. So I love this theory. The word Croatoan actually also has a lot of really weird things connected with it throughout history. For example, there was a ship that just kind of crashed into a dock and nobody was on it. It was just completely deserted, and the word Croatoan was written everywhere. Supposedly, Poe, the writer Edgar Allan Poe, supposedly Croatoan was one of the last words that he muttered before he died a pretty strange death. So who knows? Maybe the word is cursed. Who knows? But so yeah, that's the story of the time that we accidentally lost an entire colony. So since Roanoke was obviously a failure because we lost literally all of the people, um, Jamestown is going to be the first permanent British settlement, and that happens in 1607. It's chartered by the Virginia Company. The Virginia Company is a joint stock company. Essentially, what that means is you have a bunch of different people who own stock in this company that buys the charter to the colony. So it's almost like they own a little chunk of the colony, because it's expensive to buy a whole entire colony yourself, I guess. So they are using this as a way to make money. That's kind of important. So the people who are going to go over to Jamestown, for the most part, are a group called the Second Sons. So we refer to them as the Second Sons not because they are necessarily the second sons of people, but because they were not the typical like families that you see going to other colonies. They were usually single men who were from affluent families, that weren't inheriting land. So, like, if you were the second son of a rich guy, then the first son was the one that was going to inherit all of the land. So the second sons would come to Jamestown and they wanted to find gold. The problem is there wasn't a whole bunch of gold in Virginia like there had been in places that the Spanish had colonized. And so instead of like planting and making sure that they were going to be okay in the future, they just looked for gold. And so that's going to result in something called the starving time, which is what it sounds like. They didn't plant and they didn't plan ahead, and so they get to the winter and they almost starve to death. It supposedly gets so bad that they start eating like all of their animals that they're not supposed to eat. And there are even reports of cannibalism. So they end up making it through this. They make it through it because of the Powhatan natives. And so those are the natives, if you've ever watched Pocahontas, they were the Powhatans. Now, the Powhatans help them through this time period, but it ends up being kind of fraught with warfare and tension and things like that. And that's kind of going to be the relationship that Native Americans have with the British. It's very, very tense, and we don't really like each other very much. And this is kind of counter to what a lot of us have been taught growing up. Growing up, we kind of think, oh, they were friends with all of the natives and the natives helped them. And yeah, the natives did help them. The Powhatans helped. We're going to talk about the Plymouth colony in a minute, where the natives helped them. But it always turns ugly pretty fast. So the Powhatans help them. They make it through. And I actually want you guys to watch this video. This is going to kind of explain to you a little bit of what happened in Jamestown, but it's also going to explain to you the difference between the Pocahontas film and what actually happened in history. One thing that I want you guys to get out of this class is there are a lot of films that are really, really great that tell us about history, but sometimes our only conception of history is a movie that we watch. And so a lot of people think that they know how Native American history worked because they've watched Pocahontas. So I want you guys to kind of see the difference. I want you guys to see the comparison. So watch that video. It's not very long. It's pretty cool. And I mean, it's about the Pocahontas movie. So like, it's great. But a couple things that I want to talk about having to do with Virginia, and these are really, really important. The first is something called the House of Burgesses. Now, the House of Burgesses is super, super significant because this is the first time that the colonists come over and they govern themselves. Why is this so important? So the British give the charter to the Virginia Company. The Virginia Company sends over colonists and they let them govern themselves. Later on, when we get to the American Revolution, that is going to be extremely significant because from the very beginning of British colonization, people have run things for themselves. They've governed themselves. Okay. The other really important thing that I want to talk about is the headright system. So in a few minutes, we're going to talk about African chattel slavery and the development of that, and we're going to compare it to something called indentured servitude. Indentured servitude is going to begin because of the headright system. So with the headright system, 50-acre lots are given to people who pay their own passage to the New World. So let's say you have a family of 4. That family of 4 is going to get 200 acres of land because they paid their own way over here. Now, if you're too poor to afford to pay your own way over, you can find somebody willing to pay your way. If you do that, you will sign what's called an indenture, which is a contract that says, okay, of my 50 acres, I will give you blah. So usually what would end up happening is they would give up most, if not all, of the land just to be able to come over to the New World. And then they would also sign the contract for a period of servitude to pay back the cost of them coming over. So they basically become slaves. And we'll talk about the difference between African slaves and the indentured servants, but essentially they're slaves for a certain period of time. After their indenture is over, they get whatever land they were promised in that indenture. But because of the headright system, that 50 acres of land technically is going to the guy who paid. And that's true to an extent. We came here for our own religious freedom, basically. So the Puritans came here for their religious freedom so that they could be free. But they didn't necessarily come here so that other people could have the freedom to practice their own religions. In order to live in a Puritan colony, you had to join that church. The Quakers were a little bit different. And so this is where we're going to see differing religions kind of coming together in a melting pot, whether that's differing denominations of Christianity or like this is where you're going to see Jews come over a lot of the time. Now, the final colony I want to talk about is Georgia. And of course, there is a Georgia history component to this class, so we're going to focus a little bit more on Georgia than we would any of the other colonies. Georgia was the last of the 13 original colonies, and it was established in 1732. Now, that's kind of important because we're going to talk next time about the French Indian War. The French Indian War is going to happen not too terribly long after Georgia became a colony, and then very close on the heels of it, you have the American Revolution. Now, Georgia was founded by a guy named James Oglethorpe. James Oglethorpe was the founder and the resident trustee who was aided by this guy named Tomochichi. Tomochichi was the chief of the Yamacraw, and we're actually going to talk a little bit about the Yamacraw when we talk about the Yamasee War with the French Indian War. So you've got Tomochichi helping out as well as Mary Musgrove. She was an interpreter. And the Yamacraw, they were a small band of natives that existed from the late 1720s until the 1740s as a result of the Yamasee War. The colony was intended originally as something called a debtor colony. So a debtor colony is for people who couldn't pay their debts. Now, people used to go to debtor prisons. But instead, we're going to, that does not even look like the word prison. That's fine. Prison. So instead of sending them to prison, we are going to send them to this colony. That way they can start paying off their debts. They can kind of live their own lives. This is going to help with overcrowding in the prison system in Britain. The other intentions are to increase Britain's wealth through the mercantile system, through basically making a profit. and as a buffer against Indian attacks. Now, this makes a lot of sense if you think about it. So you've got Florida at this point is actually owned by the Spanish, and there are also lots of native groups around like the southern sort of area of Georgia and that Florida border. So we kind of wanted to send people that we didn't really care about, i.e., debtors, poor people. We wanted to send them to this colony so that they could be almost like a first line of defense, so that our expensive crops and the people that we really did care about, the more like landowning elite, so that they would be protected. Now, slavery and hard liquor were originally banned in Georgia. Now, this isn't going to last for all that long, but originally the idea was that since you had these debtors coming in, they didn't need to have slaves. They didn't need to have liquor to kind of distract them from what they needed to be doing. But very quickly, you're going to get other people moving into Georgia because Georgia has kind of this mild climate. It's pretty fertile. And so people are pretty quickly going to be like, hey, we need slaves because otherwise we're not going to be able to make a lot of money. And money was really what Britain was after as far as their colonies. Some other weird things, though, that were banned include Catholics and lawyers. Lawyers originally weren't allowed in Georgia. Right, so let's kind of shift a little bit from talking about these regions and colonies to talking about colonial America in general. And one of the big things that is going to kind of um, illustrate colonial America and make it what it was is the slave trade. Now, the slave trade isn't unique to the colonies. It's also not even unique to the Americas, but it is going to become huge here. So what you're going to see is the emergence of something called the triangular trade. The triangular trade is named the triangular trade because it basically looks like a triangle. So first leg of the journey, you're going to be going from Europe to Africa. There's our first leg of our little triangle. That line got away from me, you guys. It's pretty thick. So we're going to Africa and we're going to trade iron products specifically, but other things as well for slaves. Now, these slaves, because a lot of people have some misconceptions, and a lot of people have some ideas. Like, I've heard people say, well, it wasn't completely Europeans' fault that slavery was a thing because Africans were the ones selling slaves into slavery. So there is a little bit of truth to that, yes. Africans were trading other Africans into slavery, but you got to understand some stuff. Just like when we talked about the Native Americans, we have a tendency to group Native Americans together and we have a tendency to group Africans together because they look kind of the same. But these were people from individual tribes, regions, groups. They had their own kind of enmities. They had their own issues with one another. And so usually what you would see is warring tribes would trade other, like people from other tribes. So they're not necessarily trading their own people as far as they're concerned, because race is a socially constructed thing, you guys. And so they weren't like, we're black, we have to stick together, because that wasn't really a thing at this point. They were like, well, we are this tribe and they are this tribe, and so they are different than us. So yeah, they weren't, as far as they were concerned, like selling out their brethren or anything like that. You also have to think about the fear, because these people, if they didn't trade others into the slave trade, they risked being kidnapped themselves. And you have to think about this, and this is something that not a lot of people understand. Slavery has existed pretty much for all of history, but chattel slavery has not. Slavery has been practiced, I mean, like the Greeks and the Romans, they had slaves, but usually slavery was a little bit different than what you see in the Americas. It wasn't race-based, and a lot of the time it wasn't like a for life kind of thing. It wasn't sun up to sundown. It wasn't the same thing as what we think of as slavery. And so the life that people are being sold into isn't necessarily what people would have anticipated historically speaking. Now I'm not trying to make excuses, like very rude to sell people into slavery, obviously. But I just want you guys to kind of have the background and the knowledge to kind of make your own decision. So that's the first leg of our journey. And then we have this part. This part, we're going to make it just as thick as the other one so it doesn't look weird. This part is called the Middle Passage. All right, so the Middle Passage is this really treacherous journey from Africa to the Americas. Slaves were packed kind of like sardines onto these ships and taken to the Americas. Slave trading posts like the one at Fort Elmina in current-day Ghana were really common. And so they would kind of hold slaves there, and then they would be shipped off to the Americas. Something else that was really common is something called the gowrie. The gowrie is this, it's a slave stick. It can be used for one or more people, and it was almost like a choke chain for a dog. That's essentially what it functioned as. It was terrible. The reason that you see slaves packed the way that they were onto these slaves is the idea is enough would make it alive for it to be profitable regardless, and you wanted as many as possible. So you've got the slaves going this way, and then there would be trade for all sorts of stuff, especially like tobacco, later on sugar, and so then we have our entire triangle for our triangular trade. Slaves, once they reached the Americas, were usually sold at auction. Sometimes it was like an outdoor big auction kind of thing. Slaves that were expected to fetch much larger prices were held at private auctions. And sometimes the slaves were actually sold on the ship, especially like slaves who were lower priced, who had maybe had some injuries, some illnesses, stuff like that. And they were just kind of like picked up for a certain price. A lot of the time after this, they were branded like cattle. So they literally had hot pokers put into their skin to brand them. Now, branding would be done for who your owner was, but also a lot of the time slaves would be branded, like if they did something like try to run away, they could be branded for that. So obviously, African slaves were treated pretty horribly. It is probably the greatest American atrocity was this period of slavery from the inception of the United States all the way until the end of the Civil War. Initially, African slaves were treated almost like indentured servants, though, because remember, I told you guys African chattel slavery was kind of unique. And so originally you would have slaves being bought and then after a while given their freedom, maybe, or their children would be born free, things like that. And so you ended up with a lot of free Black people in the very early colonies, but that is very quickly going to shift. So they could initially work in exchange for their freedom. And you've got those indentured servants who are working in exchange for their passage to the New World. Now, both slaves and indentured servants could be bought, sold, or leased, and they could be punished by whipping. But there are some differences, and the biggest difference, you guys, is indentured servants come voluntarily, and they have a mutual contract. They have rights. African slaves come against their will, and they don't have any sort of contract or any sort of rights. Now, initially, both sometimes have the opportunity to get out of servitude, not always. Sometimes slaves were bound for life, but initially, a lot of the time, African slaves could earn or buy their freedom, or they could at least work outside of their slave duties, earn up money, and maybe buy their freedom or freedom for somebody else. Eventually, though, the laws are going to change and they're going to be bound for life. Now, another difference that actually is against the favor of the indentured servants is since the landowner knows that their contract is eventually going to be up, they were very often abused and even killed. They weren't given as much as far as like subsistence. They weren't taken care of as well. And a lot of the time they would die before they could ever earn their freedom. African slaves who people paid a lot of money for were often abused, but they were very rarely killed because they didn't have a certain term of indenture. So even if the slaves were going to be freed at some point, there wasn't a specific timeline, and so there was more incentive to keep them alive. But they did have very few opportunities to earn or buy their freedom. Now, like I said, this is going to change. The very small difference that you see between indentured servants and slaves is going to change, and it's going to start largely with something called Bacon's Rebellion, which unfortunately has absolutely no bacon involved. I know that you feel like you've been lied to. That's how I felt when I learned about it for the first time, too. So, Bacon's Rebellion is led by this guy named Nathaniel Bacon. And this is the first time that Englanders are going to fight against each other. And it's going to be poor Englanders against rich, against the guys that are in charge, against the government. Now, these poor people that are fighting are going to be both poor white people, indentured servants, and just people that don't have a bunch of money, as well as poor black people. The slaves are going to join in, or the free black people who are also poor. And this is going to start because the governor wasn't protecting the poor colonists along the frontier from native attacks. So first we need to kind of understand what the frontier is, right? What is that? So the frontier is kind of almost like the line of civilization. It's kind of the end of what we have built. It's where you see less farmland and it's more, forests and stuff like that. There's more Native Americans. It's not cultivated. And so living on the frontier is a lot more dangerous than living in the city. People are living farther apart from each other. They generally have less money, and it's more dangerous. There could be attacks. There's not as many like hospitals and things like that. So it's a lot more dangerous. And so these people on the frontier, since they're generally poorer, because if you have enough money, you're going to live where civilization is, right? Since they're generally poorer, the governor and the government didn't really care that much about them, and so they weren't really giving them a lot of protection. So the first thing that they're going to do is they are going to attack about 1,000 Pamunkey natives. Unfortunately, the Pamunkey were actually a friendly native group. Like I said, we kind of conflate all of these different Native Americans. We're like, an Indian is an Indian. And so it was actually the friendly ones that we attacked instead of the ones that were attacking us. Whoops. When that doesn't help anything, they start to go up against the government. Now, this is going to fizzle out after Bacon dies of dysentery. So they don't win, right? It's not a successful rebellion, but it is a significant one. It is hugely, hugely important because this marks the first time that the poor are going to rise up against the rich. Poor people are going to rise up against the people in power, the people in the government, and it's not just poor white people. It's poor white people, poor black people, it's just poor people. And so if you think about it, when you think about a hierarchy, right? A hierarchy is generally kind of like a triangle, because if you want to be in power, you have to have people that you're in power over. So these guys at the top of the hierarchy, they are the ones with the money and the power and all that fun stuff. But this is most of the population. Gotta have people to have power over. Now, the best way to keep yourself in power, because there's not very many of you guys, the best way to keep yourself in power is to divide this group of people. If you have divisions, then you can take over. You can keep people from fighting you. So this scares the rich, and it's going to mark the effective end of the indentured servitude period and the start of the race line. We're going to start to see white people and black people being turned against one another. Okay, so I told you guys that we were going to talk more about the regions of colonial America than we talked about the 13 colonies. So there are three major regions in colonial America: New England, the Chesapeake, and the Lower South. And they were all very, very different. The Chesapeake is kind of like a combination between New England and the Lower South. And so this is really where you're going to get that whole North versus South mentality that we see later on. And it's because they have such different populations, different groups of people. They're different kind of geographically. They have different religious influences, different means of education, and even different treatment of women. And so I want you guys to take the time, read this little chart, make these comparisons. That way you'll kind of understand how the North versus South mentality comes to exist. Another thing I want to talk about are called slave codes. Slave codes are going to fundamentally alter the practice of African slavery. And so just a few of the things that you're going to see after Bacon's Rebellion include slaves becoming property for life, children starting to inherit the status. Additionally, you see it start to be a crime to teach slaves to read or to write. Conversion to Christianity is no longer going to be grounds for freedom. And you're also going to see mixing of races not being tolerated. Now let's look at an example of a slave code. So this is from 1664 in Maryland. Slave codes differed from place to place, but they all have fairly similar features. So, for example, that whatsoever freeborn English woman shall intermarry with any slave shall serve the master of such slave during the life of her husband, and that all the issue of such freeborn women so married shall be slaves as their fathers were. So this one is telling us if you're a freeborn English woman, all right, so English, and we're going to assume that kind of means white, right? So if you're a white chick and you marry any slave, if you are a white woman and you marry a black man, you will serve the master of that slave during the life of your husband. If you decide, so they're not saying, hey, if you're a white woman, you can't marry a black guy, right? They're saying if you decide to marry a black guy, you're a slave. I don't know about you guys, but do any of you love your mans so much that you're like, yes, I'm going to be a slave, a literal slave because of him? I don't know about all that, right? It also goes on to say, any of the issue of such freeborn women so married shall be slaves as their fathers were. So issue is kind of an outdated term. It's one that you might not know, but we're going to use some context clues. And in here, it says they'll be slaves as their fathers were. So this issue here, this means their children. So if you marry a slave, not only are you condemning yourself to a life of slavery, but also your children. So those slave codes are used to severely limit and regulate the lives of slaves after Bacon's Rebellion. And that's going to kind of codify the African chattel slavery that we see up until 1865. Now, there are going to be some rebellions, okay? So a few years ago, my good friend, Kanye West, right? He said something along the lines of slavery was a choice because if it hadn't been a choice, then the slaves, there were more of them, they would have just rose up, they would have gotten out of slavery, they could have done more, right? And here's the thing, Kanye does not hold much stock in history. He actually, another thing that he said at some point was that he was too busy writing history to learn it. So he obviously, he hasn't had my class, okay? And so something that Kanye didn't really understand is at no point in time were there actually more slaves than there were white people in the South. Now, there were times, a lot of times, where there were more slaves than there were slave owners. But we're going to talk later on about how there's actually a huge population in the South of free poor white people who did not have the ability at any point to obtain any slaves. So on a plantation, perhaps there would be lots of slaves and not very many white people. And so it would have been easier for them to rise up than if there were a lot of white people around. But you got to remember, they weren't allowed to read or write. They weren't allowed to have weapons. They weren't allowed to have a lot. And then on top of that, if they did rebel, they were living in places that were surrounded by poor white people who, because of stuff like Bacon's Rebellion, had had years and years, if not generations, of being told that they were better than these black people. So there aren't that many rebellions. The largest one in the colonies is called the Stono Rebellion, and this is going to start with about 20 or so slaves, and it's led by a literate slave named Cato. All right, so Cato is actually a fairly recent transfer from Africa. In some textbooks, you might see him called Jimmy. That's because Jimmy was his slave name, Cato was his African name. And I feel like if we ever have a choice between names to call people, we should call them the ones that they want to be called. It costs us nothing. And so Cato was the name he was born with. That's how we're going to refer to him. Now, Cato was a literate slave, meaning that he could read and write, and he had fairly recently come from Africa, from a kind of warfaring tribe, and so he starts this. It grows to about 100 people, but it is stopped within a week, because remember, they don't have access to weapons. They can obviously steal some along the way, but they are surrounded by poor white people who don't want them to escape. They kill 2 storekeepers and a total of about 20 more white people along their march. But about 40 slaves are killed while suppressing the uprising. And then you have to think about the terrible, terrible consequences for the other 60 or so when they are apprehended. Now, in addition to that, though, in addition to those consequences, after all of this, South Carolina, where this occurred, is going to pass the Negro Act of 1740. And that's going to do a few things. It's going to restrict slave assembly and movement. So they won't be able to meet together. It reminds me a little bit of in Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix, Umbridge won't let groups meet together, clubs, stuff like that, because of the ministry's fear of what grows to become Dumbledore's army. It's kind of like that. We have this fear of if we let them assemble, they're going to plot their escape. And also, slaves used to be able to go, not freely necessarily, but they used to be able to go from place to place, especially when they'd finish their duties. They would be allowed to maybe travel to other plantations to see family, stuff like that. That's going to be severely restricted. We're also going to stop importing slaves for a period of time. And after we start that import, again, it's going to be made very, very careful that people from the same tribes, from the same origins, don't go in large numbers to the same plantations, because that's actually something that Cato is going to use to his advantage. He's going to have people that we're fairly certain, looking back historically, were maybe they were definitely a part of the tribe that he came from and were maybe soldiers under his command at some point or something like that. All right, so let's shift away from talking about slavery and talk about religion for just a few minutes. So I want to talk about the First Great Awakening. Now, there's going to be a couple of these in American history. This one is a movement that happens in the 1730s, and it's associated with something called the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment is all about encouraging individualism over tradition. We're going to start to see move away from the way things used to be done, the very kind of ritualized Christianity. And so you see this not just within religion, but in society in general. And society is going to have an impact on the way religion happens. And so as society starts to change a little bit, you're going to start to see changes within religion being characterized by revivals. So revivals, they look kind of like this. You're going to have kind of a big authoritarian, really like great at speaking orator kind of dude, right? Who's going to get up and make everybody feel something. And so you'll have these big meetings, and it's going to emphasize a more personal, emotional relationship with God. So the idea of, you pray, and when you pray, it's not just a prayer that you've memorized. It's, you're having a relationship with God. You're not just going to church and doing what you're supposed to. You're having a relationship. And it rejects an idea that was really important in the church before this, which is something called predestination. Predestination reminds me a little bit of Santa Claus. Because Santa, he makes his list, he checks it twice, right? Have you been good? Have you been bad? Which list are you on? Predestination, you got the same sort of list. You've got the good and you've got the bad. And so this is a list, though, that's written before anybody is ever born. Predestination is the idea that it doesn't matter how you live your life, you were either destined to go to heaven or you were destined not to. Now, this you would think would make people be like, well, either I'm going to heaven or I'm burning in hellfire, so I'm finna do whatever I want and it'll be fine. But what actually ends up happening as a general rule is people try to live their best lives to prove that they are on the predestination heaven list. But it becomes a little bit old after a while, especially when you're encouraging that relationship with God. The idea that God already decided about you doesn't really encourage much of a relationship with Him. So we reject that idea and we start to go with the idea that your actions can determine whether you're saved. But it's going to capitalize on fear. Lots and lots of fear. It's a very like fire and brimstone and hell. It's very like angry, kind of. That's my angry face. So it's very much God is mad and you don't deserve heaven, but He might let you go there. So let's look at an example of that. Right, so this is part of a speech given by a guy named Jonathan Edwards, who is one of those guys that I was talking about before, one of those revival preachers. And this is from something called Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. We're going to see how many times this guy can say wrath in this little excerpt. Okay, he says, "O sinner, consider the fearful danger you're in. It is a great furnace of wrath, a wide and bottomless pit, full of the fire of wrath, that you are held over in the hand of that God whose wrath is provoked and incensed as much against you as many of the damned in hell. You hang by a slender thread, with the flames of divine wrath flashing about it, and ready every moment to singe it and burn it asunder, and you have no interest in any mediator, and nothing to lay hold of to save yourself, nothing to keep off the flames of wrath, nothing of your own, nothing that you ever have done, nothing that you can do to induce God to spare you one moment." All right, so that is scary. Conjures up the image of God literally holding you over a pit of hellfire, and there is nothing that you can do to keep Him from just dropping you. It very much capitalizes on fear, and you want to try to make this guy that's holding you above hell as happy as possible because he has no reason to save you. This is the very essence of the idea of an angry, wrathful, vengeful God. And that's the kind of God that people get to know during the First Great Awakening. Now, we are going to see that change. We're going to see that change during the Second Great Awakening. But in this First Great Awakening, God's a pretty mad dude, according to people's interpretation. And it's this sort of mentality that we're going to see along with those Puritan ideals that we were talking about before with the Massachusetts Bay Colony in the Salem witch trials. So the Salem witch trials happened in 1692. By the end of it, 19 people are hanged, 156 imprisoned. One is pressed to death. That guy, his name is Giles Corey. I actually would suggest one of my favorite things, and we might actually watch this in class, I'm not sure, but one of my favorite things is Drunk History, The Curse of Giles Corey, and it tells you all about him being pressed to death. Um, the Salem witch trials, though, we are going to talk about a little bit more in depth in class, but they occur during this period. There's not witch burnings like a lot of people think. And it happened for maybe a myriad of reasons. We're not really sure. Some of the explanations include the fear of Native American attack because there was a war, King Philip's War, happening pretty close to them. The idea of the patriarchy, a very like stifling man-run society. There was very cold weather, unseasonably cold for years, and that is going to affect plants and crop growth and stuff like that. There's the idea of ergot poisoning. Ergot poisoning is really interesting because it grows on the wheat, and it would have made people kind of hallucinate. It would have made them really, really scared, paranoid. But the biggest explanation that we can come up with is just mass hysteria. And most likely it came from some of the ideas from like the patriarchy and the Puritan society. And those standards, they were very strict, very rigid. And so most likely it kind of started with some young girls and they were doing some stuff that they maybe should feel guilty about by Puritan standards. And so when they get caught, they accuse people of being witches and everything just kind of spirals. And so this is a little timeline for you guys to look at. Here's the Curse of Giles Corey, in case you guys wanted to watch it. This is a timeline, though, of kind of what was going on as far as the Salem witch trials. You start out with the Reverend Samuel Parris preaching in Salem. Later on, he's officially hired. His daughter in 1692 is going to fall ill along with some other young girls, and they're concluded to be bewitched. His servant Tituba is told to bake a witch's cake. Witch's cakes are wild, you guys. We'll talk about those, but basically it involves peeing in a cake. So Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne are all arrested as witches. By mid-1692, Tituba is going to confess to witchcraft. All three of the women are questioned. Other people start to be accused, including Martha Corey, who is Giles Corey's wife. By the summer of 1692, John Proctor and some others are going to write a letter from prison trying to change venues. They're like, hey, things are crazy here. We would like to maybe go somewhere else for a trial because they're arresting everybody up in here. In September, Giles Corey is going to refuse to stand trial. So until he does, rocks are piled on him, and he dies 3 days later by being pressed to death. Late 1692, Increase Mather is going to visit the Salem jail. Later, Governor Phipps is going to dissolve the court, and a Superior Court of Judicature is created to try to figure out what to do with the remaining prisoners. The remainder of them end up by the next year being pardoned. So all of this stuff is going to happen within a year. You're going to have tons of people dying. So I will see you guys next time. We're going to be talking about the French Indian War.